So now we'll spend some time talking about how this process of domestication that's being driven by humans changes the plants and animals that you're domesticating. And so we'll compare first domesticated and wild crops. Remember that one of the changes that had come with the broad spectrum revolution was the appearance or proliferation of wild stands of cereal grains. And so you have to think, firstly, as these were some of the first plants that we domesticated, you've got to think what part of the cereal grain is it that we eat. And then we by and large are eating the seeds of these cereal grains. It's one of the ways that we define them as plants, and it's what gives us the bit that we can kind of grind down into flour to make porridge or flatbread or whatever the case may be. So one of the first things that we select for then is larger seeds. Not only do we want the individual seeds to be larger, but we also want a higher yield per unit area. And so we can think about this in a couple of ways. You can think about corn, for example. When we plant a stalk of corn, we don't typically hope that it's only going to grow one ear, right? One of the things that we hope for is that each stalk of corn that we plant will grow multiple ears, and then each ear itself will have more seeds on it um, than not, right? The seeds are the part that we eat, so we want both to hold true. So this higher yield per unit area doesn't simply mean that we're getting like one seed that's bigger. It also means that we're getting multiple seeds per plant. It also means that there might be other features of the plant that kind of make the proportional representation of the seed itself larger. So we might select for fewer leaves, more seed, etc. One of the important things about grasses and grains and such. I mean, when you think about, we had this discussion while we were talking about non-human primate evolution, that fruits kind of evolved in tandem with primates, and that fruits essentially want to be eaten because they need that scarring through the digestive tract. They need the deposit of fertilizer that comes when the seed is kind of, well, I guess deposited, and that all of the kinds of aspects that make primates eat fruits, their bright color, their sweet taste, all are things that evolved in the fruit, particularly so the fruit could be eaten. Well, when you think about grass seeds, or you think about grains. Think about if you've ever taken your dog for a hike, particularly in an area that has a lot of grasses, right? How do we think about seeds from other plants that aren't fruits? How do we think about them dispersing? Well, most of you have probably blown on a dandelion, right? Wind is one method of seed dispersal. We also see seeds that disperse with rain. There are certain seeds that are able to float, for example, so that particularly if they're in an environment that's characterized by seasonal floods, then part of their adaptive strategy may be to strategically float during times where the field is flooded. But the third way is one that's pretty common with grasses, and that is that seeds try to get entangled in the coats, in the fur coats of mammals, or are carried away by birds, or whatever the case may be. And so when you think about these grass seeds, and you think about hiking with your dog, one of the things that inevitably happens if you're hiking in a grassy area with your dog is they get seeds embedded in their fur, and so it's hard. It's hard to get those seeds out of the fur because they have barbs on them. They are shaped in a way that when you try to get them out, they just kind of burrow in deeper. So this isn't what we want with a plant that we've domesticated, that we're intentionally planting and trying to get a large crop from. We want all of those things to go away, and so we have selected over the course of this domestication process for the loss of seed dispersal, natural seed dispersal mechanisms. We also don't want wind animals rain to knock the seeds off the stem. So we selected for tougher axes, or the connective tissue that holds the seed pods to the stem. But what we do want when the seeds ripen, when they're ready to harvest, is we want the husk of the seed to break off pretty easily. And so we've selected thusly for very brittle husks. And if you've ever seen anyone like practice traditional processing techniques, there is a processing technique whereby with wheat you separate the wheat from the chaff. And so this was historically done with baskets, and even some small family farmers still do it with baskets versus machinery. But you take your wheat harvest, all you're harvesting really are the seed pods themselves. You put all of your seed pods in a basket, and then you toss those seed pods with kind of a rotary motion. So you're kind of tossing in a circle so that the seed pods rub up against each other. It is that kind of contact that starts to separate the husk from the edible portion, or the seed itself. And then as you're tossing it, you do it on a day that has just a little bit of a breeze, and as the wind blows through, the seeds are heavy. The seeds still fall back down to the basket, but the chaff, or the husk of the wheat, blows away in the wind. And so you just keep doing that until what you've got left is a basket full of completely edible wheat. For animals, we're looking for a different suite of traits. Generally, we want animals that are smaller and easier to control. I've mentioned the auroch in this class before. The auroch is an ancestral native cattle species for the Scottish Highlands that researchers have really discussed the ethics of bringing back the auroch. The Highlands of Scotland have suffered by not having large-bodied grazers to trample the earth. It's impacting indigenous plants and such. And so there's hope that because the auroch has only recently gone extinct, that it may be relatively easier to kind of backbreed, take cattle that have been domesticated from the auroch, and kind of work backwards to reintroduce the species. When you think about a species like the auroch or Bison antiquus, we're talking about bovines that are 8 to 9 feet at the shoulder. Can you imagine the running of the bulls in Pamplona with bulls that were 8 or 9 feet at the shoulder? We're not going to typically want really huge animals for our domesticated livestock. We need to be able to control them. With respect to controlling them, we've also selected away traits that they have that make them dangerous to us. And so their natural defense mechanisms are one of these that, typically male mammals, when they've got these polygynous breeding systems, they often have some kind of armament that's meant for male-male competition. And so for bighorn sheep, for mountain goats, for many wild cattle species, etc., we're talking about either horns or tusks kinds of things. So what males then do is they come together in combat competition during the breeding system. If you've spent any time watching deer or elk during the breeding season, they come together and do what's called rutting, which is where they just run at each other with their heads lowered so that their antlers connect, and then they kind of try to wrestle each other, or winner takes all. Bighorn sheep will do similar sorts of behaviors. Wild goats will do similar sorts of behaviors. So we've selected those traits away so that we don't get hurt in this process of handling these animals. Now the problem is, when we select those traits away, we create a situation where they don't have a way of defending themselves. So we really create a stronger reliance on humans for being able to keep their herds of livestock safe. And so we might employ shepherds, right? We might have people who are in the field with the animals, even at night. We might utilize dogs with respect to like sheepdogs and such, so that dogs are able to protect their flocks from predators like coyotes, wolves, etc. We might even, in New Mexico, one of the animals that like the Navajo use to protect their herds of the churro sheep are donkeys. Donkeys make an incredibly loud and annoying sound when coyotes are close by, plus they've got a pretty mean kick. So, again, using another domesticated species to keep one species safe, but it becomes necessary when we've taken away natural defense mechanisms. Lastly, we select for other traits that we find useful or that have been critical kind of in this process of domestication. So we started with caprine domestication, that is goats and sheep, and the areas where we were trying to establish domesticated livestock, domesticated goats and sheep, were very dry, warm, arid areas. And so one of the things that we selected for was hair that stood up and away from the coat. We selected for that woolly texture. And what this does is, with the hair standing up off of the skin, it kind of creates a space where when the wind blows, the air can blow through and evaporatively cool the animal. So it helps to keep animals from overheating in that hot kind of arid environment. It's also nice, of course, that in the process of selecting for wool that helps keep animals from overheating, we also ended up with something that we were able to spin and weave and utilize to manufacture clothing. So different traits for different animals. For many pastoral populations, you're selecting your flock based or your herd based on milk production, for example. So if you've got females that aren't able to produce enough milk even to sustain their offspring, you're probably going to end up at some point culling them from your herd, slaughtering them, trading them away, etc., because it's not going to be beneficial in the long run. One other effect then of food production, and it's kind of mediated through these increasing group sizes, is this transition to state level socio-political systems. And so we don't see food production emerge overnight. It's a gradual process whereby first you're foraging and you start to dabble in utilizing plants that perhaps are predisposed to being domesticated. Then you might garden or plant certain crops, but still base the bulk of your diet on hunted game or gathered resources. Then you might base the bulk of your diet on things that you cultivate, but still rely somewhat, still supplement your diet with meat that you hunt. Then we transition to this full reliance on domesticated species. So it takes a couple of thousands of years, really, but to transition fully from the Mesolithic into the Neolithic. Now, with food production, as we've already mentioned, comes larger group sizes because of the effect on female, the energetics of reproduction, walking shorter distances, lower energetic output, availability of weaning foods, etc. This results in population increases. Interestingly, once our populations start to increase, there's really no going back. If because of cultivation your population grows, then you really don't have that flexibility at any point in time to decide, no, I think we'll go back to foraging, because you've already got this larger population base. When populations increase, you've got a couple of options. You can fight to the death, right? You can migrate out. And so one of the effects of food production in these population increases are increased migrations. And of course, when people migrate, they not only take themselves and their belongings, but they also take the knowledge that they've built up. And so as people migrate out of areas where they've been practicing agriculture, they're not going to go back to foraging when they get to a new place. They're going to take that knowledge and seeds and the technology and practices to back to or with them wherever they go, so that they're able to practice agriculture in a new area. What this does is forces people in the new areas to respond. So let's say you're living a fairly plush sedentary foraging lifestyle, and someone migrates in who brings with them domesticated cereal grains. You could just sit there and watch as their population base gets larger and larger, and eventually they outcompete you. But more realistically, it means that you're going to have to perhaps barter to get some seeds and eventually adopt agriculture yourself. So these people in neighboring areas really are forced to respond when someone else brings that technology into the region. By 7,000 years before present, we've got simple irrigation systems that help to move water, typically tapping into a river or a spring, and then using a system of ditches, acequias, etc., to bring that water to the plants. By 6,000 years before present, because of the increasing demands of ever increasing group sizes, we develop complex irrigation systems, and this allows agriculture to be an option for more southern arid lowlands. So agriculture becomes even more widespread, which forces more people to adopt agriculture. Now, one interesting thing that we're not going to necessarily explicitly talk about is that one of the theories that has some pretty strong support for it, for the emergence of states, is control over hydraulic systems. You know, the idea that as you build irrigation systems, you need to maintain them, you need to protect them. They kind of create work in and of themselves. They're necessary to produce food, but they require a workforce to be able to repair and keep them. And so because of that, they require kind of infrastructure and bureaucracy, and thusly the emerging state. Around 5,500 years before present, we see the Mesopotamian state first arise. This is a state-level society that has an economy based on agriculture. It relies upon hydraulic systems with irrigation, also relies upon long-distance trade. That is a second theory of state formation, that it is kind of communities that are built at key areas along trade routes that are able to then capitalize upon people passing through and build this full-fledged state economy. So if you want to be able to control these strategic areas like river narrows, like mountain passes, etc., you're going to need to develop the infrastructure and the bureaucracy again in order to exclude others from using your crossings, but also to be able to kind of exact taxation or some kind of tribute for other people also using your crossing. Anyway, the states are characterized by central governments, permanent central governments, with a kind of hierarchical organization, extreme contrasts of wealth, with wealth being concentrated in the hands of a few, with most people falling into the quote-unquote working class, and distinct hierarchical social classes. That is one of the other key critical features of states. Chiefdoms, which are also agricultural in nature and are a ranked society. Chiefdoms have a continuum of ranks, whereby the more closely related you are to the chief, the higher ranking you are. But one of the things that these early states try to do is to reduce the importance of kinship. And so they create these arbitrary social classes that you're born into. You don't have a choice about occupying, and reduce this reliance on kinship so that people are less likely to unite in opposition. And so we've talked about this situation in Mesopotamia really as kind of an illustrative example of how agriculture develops into larger scale societies and then transitions into states. This path to food production happened independently in at least 7 world areas. We've got 3 in the New World, including coastal Peru, Mesoamerica, and the southeastern United States, and then we've got 4 in the Old World, including this belt across sub-Saharan Africa, including the Nile River Valley, the Mesopotamia, and 2 areas in China, 1 in North China, 1 in South China. Food production, once it's innovated, spreads rapidly through trade, through diffusion, and through migration. And so this is critical in Europe and Asia, and we'll talk about that in just a little while. And so this figure looks at these 7 world areas. We see coastal Peru, we see Mesoamerica, we see southeastern United States, we've got this belt across Africa where the African cattle complex emerges, we've got Mesopotamia, and we've got North and South China.